Yeah, ma'am, thank you for that introduction. I have to say there are a few things that are not correct in the introduction. I did not finish my MS in public health. I did just one semester and then moved on to my fellowship. I think I got my board certification in the ABR around 2009 or so. I'm sorry if I had those errors in my CV. Yeah, thank you again, Kavita madam and Vijay Bhaskar sir. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. My name is Anil Dasyam, for those of you who don't know me. I am a radiologist. I work at University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which is in Pennsylvania. It's in the northeastern part of US. I was a NIMS resident back in 2000 to 2003. I was taught by Uma madam, Josna madam, Subbarao sir, of course, Kakala Subbarao sir, and Jagan Mohan sir, and Ramurthy sir. Those were like great days. I learned a lot, not only from my teachers, but also from my colleagues, Sai Ram and others, and also my juniors. They're all like brilliant. So it was a great time, the 3 years that I had over in NIMS. Today, I'm going to share a few interesting pancreatic and biliary cases. I do not have any disclosures. Before I begin, again, I would like to thank Kavita madam and Vijay Bhaskar sir for giving me this opportunity to give this talk. And I also want to acknowledge help that I received from Navya Dasyam, Alessandro Furlan, and Venkat Subaya in preparing for this talk. I have some interesting cases. These are not really at the resident level. They're a little bit higher than that. But since you're all students of KJ, I think it will not be too bad for you. The selection of cases too, if you like these cases, I'm happy to take all the credit. If you don't think these are appropriate cases, you have to blame Subaya, because his influence was pretty large in choosing these cases. The way I'm going to go ahead with this is it's going to be sort of informal. I have a few cases. For each case, I'm going to give you some images, a brief clinical history, patient demographics, and then there will be a question with a few options. And you can scan this QR code or use the link on top of that to answer the question. So I'm going to start with my first case. This is a 48-year-old woman with history of abdominal pain and steatorrhea. She was diagnosed with chronic pancreatitis around 20 years earlier. Here I have CT scan images, axial and coronal plane. They are in soft tissue window and bone window. And my question here is, what is the diagnosis? The options are, is this a hereditary pancreatitis, main duct IPMN, alcoholic chronic pancreatitis, or densely calcified neuroendocrine tumor? I'm just going to give you a few seconds to look over the images and type in your answers. The responses are all going to be anonymous, so feel free to go ahead and answer. I'm not sure if that makes any big difference to you or not. If you have trouble using the QR code or anything, just let me know. Okay, I see that there's only one person who's responded here. Okay, so I'll move on to. Okay, see, there's one more person who's responded. We have main duct IPMN and hereditary pancreatitis as the options here. Okay, so the answer is hereditary pancreatitis. We see calcifications in pancreas in a variety of settings that are listed here. Sometimes you see these in patients with non-neoplastic cystic entities or collections like pseudocyst. For example, this patient had a pseudocyst, which over a period of 6 years decreased in size but started developing some mural calcifications. We can see calcifications in pancreatic cystic lesions. In fact, the pattern of calcification may even help us in identifying what the entity is. For example, in mucinous cysternoma, we tend to see calcifications in the peripheral portion, while serous cysternoma tends to have calcifications in the central portion. We can also see calcifications in solid pancreatic neoplasms, of which neuroendocrine tumor is the most common. Pancreatic adenocarcinoma doesn't usually have calcifications. Very rarely, you can also see calcifications in pancreatic adenocarcinoma, as in this patient who had moderately differentiated adenocarcinoma with mucinous features. Coming back to our patient, here I have two patients. On the top row, we have our patient with hereditary pancreatitis, and for comparison, this is a patient with idiopathic chronic pancreatitis in the bottom row. We have axial and coronal images, and both of these patients have obstructing interductal calculus, upstream pancreatic ductal dilation, and surrounding parenchymal atrophy. So what are the features that help us in raising the suspicion for hereditary pancreatitis? There are two key imaging findings here. One is these patients tend to have large interductal calculi, and the diameter of the calculus tends to be typically over 15 millimeters. And the second thing is these calculi tend to have a central lucency, giving a bullseye appearance. And the clinical relevance of this is that when you identify somebody as having hereditary pancreatitis, they are more likely to have technical success when they undergo endotherapy. In fact, my gastroenterology colleagues talk about how these stones are soft and sometimes have a toothpaste-like consistency, and they're easier to deal with. But the more important clinical relevance is that these patients are prone for pancreatic cancer. The risk is around 50 to 70 fold. And because they're prone for pancreatic cancer, they'll have to undergo screening for pancreatic cancer starting at a particular age. And you may also have to do genetic counseling to identify other members of his family or the patient's kin who may have hereditary pancreatitis. Okay, moving on to the second case. This is an 86-year-old man with intermittent shortness of breath and decreased energy for 1 week. I have CT scan images at the level of pancreas, both unenhanced and post-contrast phases. And the question is, what's the diagnosis here? Pancreas has like a sausage appearance to it. And the options are autoimmune pancreatitis, pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma, pancreatic lymphoma, and pancreatic Kastner cell carcinoma. Again, I'm going to wait for a few seconds to see if anybody's interested in responding. Just going to wait for a few more seconds to see if anybody wants to respond. So far, autoimmune pancreatitis is a front runner. Okay, pancreatic lymphoma. Okay, so the correct answer is pancreatic lymphoma. And the key imaging findings that help us in making this diagnosis in this case are, one is there's marked enlargement of the pancreas, and the mass still remains fairly homogeneous, both in the unenhanced and post-contrast phases. The mass is fairly large and is encasing the peripancreatic vessels, including the splenic artery and splenic vein. But despite the encasement, these vessels remain patent. Even the splenic vein does not show much narrowing, which is something that we often tend to see with lymphoma. This patient also has, in addition, enlarged retroperitoneal lymph nodes. And these constellation of findings favor the diagnosis of lymphoma. Just like apparently normal sausages are of different kinds, pancreatic sausages and their morphology and their etiology can also be pretty variable. The most classic example is IgG4 related autoimmune pancreatitis, where you tend to see a pretty bulky body and tail of pancreas. Often they tend to have this capsule or rind around the pancreas, which tends to be T2 hypointense and shows enhancement in the delayed phase. This is the typical appearance for IgG4 related autoimmune pancreatitis, but there are other entities that can give a sausage appearance to the pancreas. Rarely you can see pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma do the same thing as in this patient. It's unusual to see a enhancing capsule around the pancreatic cancer, but this patient actually did have one. But when you see a patient with pancreatic adenocarcinoma having a sausage appearance, it automatically means that these patients have pretty extensive malignancy involving much of the body and tail of pancreas predominantly. And because this malignancy is so extensive, to give that appearance, often they tend to have also extensive regional vascular involvement, and you may even see distant metastasis. The prognosis is usually poor when you see such an appearance. This patient actually died 3 months after the CT scan. Autoimmune pancreatitis is not only from IgG4 related diseases, there are other entities that can do that. And one such entity is checkpoint inhibitor related autoimmune pancreatitis. This patient had a history of renal cell carcinoma, underwent right nephrectomy, and later on developed retroperitoneal lymphadenopathy that responded really well to treatment with nivolumab. But his pancreas, which was initially normal, later on showed extensive FDG avidity on a PET-CT scan. And a couple of months later, the pancreas progressively became smaller in size. And also, you can see that there is loss of lobularity of the pancreas. Here is another patient with a sort of sausage appearance. This patient had granulomatosis with polyangiitis, with predominantly pulmonary manifestations. And during his workup, he was incidentally found to have this sausage appearing pancreas. Pancreas is slightly bulky, there's loss of lobularity, there's subtle surrounding fat stranding, and the patient was asymptomatic in terms of abdomen. His amylase and lipase were not elevated, but post-treatment or a period of time, his pancreas gradually became atrophic, which is something that we often tend to see with autoimmune pancreatitis too. Here I have another example of a patient with what looks like a sausage. There is diffuse enlargement, sort of hypoenhancement of the body and tail, subtle surrounding fat stranding. But this was not autoimmune pancreatitis. This was just interstitial acute pancreatitis superimposed on chronic calcific pancreatitis. Patient had an obstructing intraductal calculus in the proximal body neck junction. And upstream to that, he had the acute interstitial pancreatitis. Over a period of time, the body and tail were more normal in thickness and enhancement, but his calcific pancreatitis progressed. Moving on to the next case. This is a 48-year-old woman with incidental pancreatic cystic lesions and punctate pancreatic calcifications. These were seen when the patient was getting worked up for trauma. And I have some images at the level of the pancreas, unenhanced and post-contrast phase CT scan images, and subsequent MRCP. Question again here is, what's the diagnosis? Is this multifocal branch duct IPMNs, pancreatic amyloidosis, serous cystadenoma, or Asner cystic transformation? Again, I'm going to give you a few seconds to look through the images, and if interested, you can respond.
You can see some answers in chat box also, Anil.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was not checking that. Okay, I see IPMN as one option. Somebody has chosen serous cystadenoma. Okay, I think I'll go for the answer. It looks like someone has got the right answer. It's actually Asner cystic transformation. So this patient later on underwent endoscopic ultrasound exam that showed multiple cystic lesions in the pancreas. None of them had any solid components, but some of the cysts had some dependent debris. When the fluid was aspirated and sent for genetic analysis, no mutations were seen. But there was still pretty high suspicion for multifocal branch duct IPMN, and patient underwent distal pancreatectomy and splenectomy. On the final path, multiple cystic lesions were seen in the pancreas, but none of them communicated with the main pancreatic duct. And the cystic lesions were lined by bland Asner epithelium. So we can see multiple pancreatic cysts rarely in some instances. For example, in cystic fibrosis, you can get the pancreatic cystosis. Here's one example. You can see that much of the pancreatic parenchyma is replaced by fat, which is typical for cystic fibrosis. Sometimes they tend to have intraductal calcifications, as you can see here. This is a pancreatic duct which is not dilated, but you can see a few scattered calcifications. In addition, patient has, there are also some calcifications seen better here. In addition, patient has these numerous cystic lesions in the body and tail region. So in the appropriate clinical context with a known history of cystic fibrosis or with these findings, we can arrive at this diagnosis. And this is a benign entity, no malignant potential. Sometimes you can see a lot of cysts in patients with VHL. This was one patient who had bilateral renal cell carcinomas requiring bilateral nephrectomies and subsequently had renal transplantation. He had this twice and both of these kidneys unfortunately failed. But the area of interest for us is the pancreas, and this patient has numerous cystic lesions throughout the pancreatic head, body, and tail. Here's another patient with VHL, again the same thing, but this patient has more prominent lesions across the spectrum. This patient not only had multiple cysts and renal cell carcinomas in both kidneys, he also had a lot of spinal hemangioblastomas that you can see on the axial and the sagittal images. But the area of interest again is pancreas for us, and he had numerous cystic lesions in the body and tail. There was a serous cystadenoma clearly in the pancreatic neck, and several neuroendocrine tumors also in the pancreatic head. So pancreatic manifestations of VHL include these three: the neuroendocrine tumors, which are solid typically, the serous cystademas, and simple cysts. It's sometimes hard to differentiate between these two, but both of these fortunately do not have any malignant potential. We can also sometimes see cysts in pancreas in patients who have adult polycystic kidney disease. They are uncommon in these patients. Usually, when seen, they're more often seen in women. And when you do see these cysts, they're usually few and they involve only small portions of the pancreas. This was the worst case of cysts that I've seen in a patient with adult polycystic kidney disease. This patient initially had bilateral nephrectomies and left lobe quadrant renal transplantation, and later on had hepatic failure requiring right lobe liver transplantation. And you can see in the pancreatic head and neck, there are numerous cystic lesions. The main pancreatic duct is not involved, non-dilated, and there are no cysts in the body and tail. So if you can exclude some of these entities which have other components and the familial history, then we are left with predominantly the multifocal branch duct IPMNs as a differential diagnosis. And Asner cystic transformation, which was previously called as Asner cell cystadenoma, it's a benign entity, unlike the IPMNs, which is a pre-malignant entity. The mean age of presentation is much less than patients with IPMN, and this is more commonly seen in women, while IPMNs do not have a female predilection. Asner cystic transformation can either be unilocular or multilocular. When it is unilocular, I don't think we can make a preoperative diagnosis, but when it is multilocular, there is a chance that we can make a diagnosis. When it is multilocular, you tend to see numerous cystic lesions, typically more than 5, and these tend to be clustered along the peripheral portion of the pancreas rather than around the central portion. And they do not communicate with the main pancreatic duct. And often they tend to have these punctate calcifications associated with the pancreatic cyst. And since this has absolutely no malignant potential, it may be clinically relevant to identify this preoperatively so that you can avoid any major surgery and avoid any aggressive long-term follow-up in these patients. Moving on to the next case. This was a 52-year-old man with history of acute necrotizing pancreatitis from alcohol abuse. On the top left, I have his initial CT at presentation. Unenhanced CT showed some peripancreatic fat stranding. And 4 days later, he had a contrast enhanced examination that showed an area of necrosis in the pancreatic body with a large adjacent acute necrotic collection that contained some hemorrhagic products, which are T1 hyperintensity, as you can see here. 6 weeks later, he presented with increasing abdominal pain and had a CT scan and MR. On the top row, you have the CT images, axial and coronal. In the bottom row, you have the MR images, T2 axial and coronal MRCT. Here, my question is, we do see a walled off necrotic collection there, but what's happening beyond that? Is there thrombosis of the main portal vein? Do you see a linear extension of the walled off necrotic collection along the hepatoduodenal ligament? Or do you actually see any fistulous communication either with the biliary tree or with the main portal vein? Once again, I'm just going to give you a few seconds to think over, look at the images and respond. Looking at the chat here, so there's one portal vein fistula, and most people, I see at least 4 of them have favored pancreatobiliary fistula. And one person mentions that there is extension around the hepatoduodenal ligament. Okay. Okay, so the answer is pancreatoportal fistula. It's an interesting entity, not seen very commonly. Partly, this may be because of lack of awareness. The key imaging findings that help us in making a diagnosis of pancreatoportal fistula are presence of water attenuation or water signal intensity in the main portal vein. And that should be contiguous and continuous with an adjacent pancreatic fluid collection. Or the filling defect in the portal vein can either be, it can also be of the same attenuation or same signal intensity as the pancreatic fluid collection, and it should be continuous with that. In this case, we see this large walled-off necrotic collection. It's continuous with this tubular structure that has a branching pattern that is what you would expect for either portal vein or bile duct. Here, the bile duct is separately seen. It's much narrower in caliber as you would expect for a normal bile duct. But also on the axial, you can see that there is change in the signal intensity of the right portal vein. Previously, you could see a flow void. Now it's filled with fluid signal intensity similar to that of the walled-off necrotic collection. Coming to its clinical relevance, when you see a pancreatoportal fistula and the filling defect within the portal vein is large, it's either occlusive or nearly occlusive, especially in the context of sepsis. These patients tend to have pretty high mortality. And there's a very high likelihood that the portal vein will remain occluded for the rest of the patient's life. While on the contrary, if you see a small subocclusive filling defect in the main portal vein, still it's a pancreatoportal fistula causing the filling defect, but it's a small subocclusive filling defect. These patients are more likely to survive, and also they're more likely to have complete patency of the main portal vein. Often these patients don't have hemorrhage, but they can. More often it is the pancreatic fluid collection that extends into the main portal vein rather than them getting bleeding. It can happen. We did actually lose one patient who had hemorrhage from pancreatoportal fistula. Going on to the next case. We have a 17-year-old girl with intermittent upper abdominal discomfort, nausea, and vomiting, which is going on for a year and a half. She did not have any history of acute pancreatitis and never had any history of elevated serum lipase levels. We have a right upper quadrant ultrasound exam on the left that shows a hypoechoic cystic lesion in the pancreatic head. She subsequently underwent endoscopic ultrasound exam that again showed this cystic lesion in the pancreatic head with some internal debris. She underwent aspiration of the fluid, which on cytology did not reveal any malignant cells. There was no elevated amylase on the fluid analysis. And also she did not have any genetic mutations in the fluid aspirate. She later on underwent MRI exam, and here we have T2 pre-contrast T1, post-contrast T1, and this was done with EOVIST. So it's a 20-minute delayed hepatobiliary phase image on the left side. And my question here is, what is the diagnosis? Is this ciliated foregut cyst, type 2 choledochal cyst, pseudocyst, or branch duct IBMN? Again, I'm going to give you a few seconds to look through and respond. Okay, looks like this is a simple case. Nobody has a wrong answer, both on the chat and here. Oh, I didn't know this was an Aunt Minnie case. But yeah, that's that's absolutely right. I think all the other things can be excluded. I don't think we can make a confident diagnosis based on imaging that this is a ciliated foregut cyst. But given these options, I think it is reasonable to come to that conclusion. So this was a ciliated forehead cyst, and this is not a type 2 choledochal cyst because there is no communication with the biliary tree. The contrast, excreted contrast in the biliary tree does not extend into this. Branch duct IPMN is very uncommon in this age group unless they have a genetic mutation in the skill gene. And yeah, so this is a simple cystic lesion. There were no enhancing components. And the key finding that helps actually in making this diagnosis preoperatively is the fluid analysis. Though they don't have any malignant cells, amylase or elevated CA or anything else, the two key things that we should look for in fluid analysis in this patient are the presence of detached ciliary tufts and presence of any ciliated epithelium. Our patient had detached ciliary tufts that helped in making the diagnosis, and the surgery was avoided. Because this is something that does not involve any high-tech or any advanced cutting-edge technology, just simple microscopic analysis of the fluid should be able to give us this diagnosis. I think it is important to know this entity. I'm saying this because I've actually seen a young teenage girl undergo Whipple procedure for an unknown cystic lesion, which later on turned out to be a cystic lymphangioma. Also, if you make this diagnosis, you not only avoid the surgery, but it also means that they don't have to undergo any aggressive or long-term imaging follow-up. The next case, here the history is really important in making the diagnosis. The imaging findings are also helpful, but history is really key here. 64-year-old woman with history of 25-pound weight loss in the last few months. She developed multiple skin lesions, mainly on the shins, and biopsy of those skin lesions showed panniculitis or fat necrosis. She had several small joints. She had swelling of several of her small joints of her hand with some purplish discoloration of the overlying skin. And she also had elevated serum lipase exceeding 11,000. I have three images in the top row, and there is a cine in the bottom row, but these static still images are more useful, I think, than the cine images. We have a heterogeneously enhancing mass in the pancreatic tail and a large mass lesion in the liver. The centrally necrotic mass lesion shows hypervascularity, and it washes out in the portovenous phase. I'm just going to quickly run through the cine and give you some time to think over and just or if you can type in the answer already, that's fine too. Okay, so here, what's the diagnosis? HCC with pancreatic metastasis, or is it a primary pancreatic malignancy with hepatic metastasis? Is this pancreatic acinar cell carcinoma, pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma, or pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor? So I'm seeing two people favor acinar cell carcinoma, and in the online chat, I see a lot of different responses. Some favor neuroendocrine tumor, some favor pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma. Okay, nobody favors HCC. It looks like everybody is divided on what this is, which pancreatic primary. So the answer is pancreatic acinar cell carcinoma. This is a very interesting entity. There's an interesting entity called as PPP syndrome. Some people call this as PPP syndrome. These patients tend to develop panniculitis, polyarthritis, and the third P is pancreatitis. Though it's not always pancreatitis, the syndrome name is PPP. These patients tend to have elevated serum lipase levels over a long period of time that results in these manifestations. And the elevated serum lipase levels can be seen either because of typically chronic pancreatitis, and sometimes it is because of hypersecretion of lipase by Asner cell carcinoma. Either way, there is this elevated serum lipase that results in fat necrosis, subcutaneous fat necrosis, which is usually seen very prominently in the legs or the shins. It also results in these polyarthritis, which is not really polyarthritis. It's actually fat necrosis within the cancellous bones close to the joints, giving them this swollen joint appearance. One of the cases that we discussed earlier was pancreatoportal fistula. That is one of the ways you can get PPP syndrome. We actually have that particular patient that I showed did not have this syndrome, but we had another patient who had a pseudocyst that communicated with the main pancreatic main portal vein and had these manifestations. Moving on to a few biliary and gallbladder cases. First, I have an 80-year-old woman with abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting. She did not have any prior history of GB or biliary surgeries or any kind of procedures. And here my question is, what's the diagnosis? Is this, okay, on this particular question, you can actually choose more than one as an option. You can have multiple options here. Cholangiocarcinoma, gallbladder carcinoma, Meniere's syndrome, and Bouvret syndrome are the options here. Top row, we have CT images unenhanced in the coronal plane, showing some calcific densities. And the MR images, coronal T2 and MRCT images show the biliary tree and those calcific densities as filling defects. Okay, looks like everybody is basically getting the right answer here. It's Meniere's syndrome and Bouvret syndrome. So this patient had cholecystoduodenal fistula, and the stone which was previously in the gallbladder migrated into the proximal duodenum, resulting in gastric outlet obstruction, which is why she had nausea and vomiting. Patient also had a stone in the GB neck cystic duct area that was compressing on the common bile duct, resulting in upstream biliary dilation. So that is the Meniere's syndrome component, while this obstructing calculus within the proximal duodenum is what results in this Bouvret syndrome. Next case, 20-year man with history of liver transplantation for alcoholic cirrhosis and HCC. And these investigations were done, the ERCP and MRCP were done for evaluation of a biliary stricture, anastomotic biliary stricture. And we will not worry about the intrahepatic bile ducts or the biliary anastomosis, it's just on the distal common duct. Here, my question is, what's happening in the distal common duct? Is this an acquired choledochal diverticulum? Is this a type 2 choledochal cyst, a branch duct IPMN, or abnormal pancreaticobiliary junction? Not many people have responded so far. Yeah, online chat, someone thinks it is abnormal pancreaticobiliary junction, and I see 3 responses here. One each for choledochal diverticulum, septicocortical cyst, and abnormal pancreaticobiliary junction. one option, somebody has answered this as A and D, polylocal diverticulum and abnormal complex biliary function. Okay, moving on to the answer. This patient has a acquired choledochal diverticulum. Again, this is a lesser known entity. It's sort of like a pulsion diverticulum occurring in the distal common duct. These patients are typically elderly age group, around 68 years is a mean age group. There's no female predilection. In fact, all these three patients, the one that I showed here, you can see a small outpouching from the distal common duct, both on the ERCP and MRCP. This was actually first identified on MRCP, and retrospectively we could see that it was already shown on a previous ERCP. This patient has two of those. He was a 70-plus-year-old man undergoing cholecystectomy. This was another patient, an 80-plus-year-old man having a choledochal diverticulum again. So all these three patients that I have seen are male, but according to an article, there is no female predilection. While most of the time we tend to see female predilection for these choledochal cysts, we don't see that here. The age group is completely different. It's supposed to be more commonly associated with some degree of intra-OD dysfunction. It's not pre-malignant. There are no known chronic complications from this, and does not need any surgical management. My last case here. This is a 74-year-old man with right upper quadrant abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting since the last few days. Patient also had obstructive LFTs. What I'm not showing here is patient had multiple other images in the past and even on the current exam, where he had a gallbladder stone that moved into the common duct, and the patient had obstructive LFTs for that reason. He did undergo ERCP and had choledocholithiasis as well as cholangitis and had to be stented. But my question is solely with respect to the gallbladder, so I did not show all those other images. So we have CT scan images at 3 different time points. The last one on the right side was immediate preoperative CT scan. The image in the center is a CT obtained 5 weeks before, and the one on the left is CT image from 3 years earlier. This MRCP image, MRI exam was done at the same time as the CT scan in the middle, around 5 weeks earlier. Coronal T2 and axial T1 weighted images. And my question is, what's the diagnosis here? Is this perforated acute cholecystitis? Is this adenomyomatous nodule-associated intracholecystic neoplasm, gallbladder carcinoma, or lymphangioma of the gallbladder? Again, I'm going to give you a few seconds. I see one answer on the chat, a perforated gallbladder, and 2 people have the right answer. This is adenomyomatous nodule-associated intracholecystic neoplasm. This is obviously not prospectively diagnosed, and I don't think I would have prospectively made a diagnosis either. But this is an interesting entity. It's a recently described entity. It is sort of analogous to branch duct IPMN. I'm sure you have seen several cases of biliary IPMN and gallbladder IPMN, what's called as the ICPN for gallbladder, which is the main duct equivalent, where you have a polypoid lesion within the gallbladder. But this branch duct IPMN equivalent of gallbladder is very unusual. It's called as adenomyomatous nodule-associated intracholecystic neoplasm. I don't think it's easy to differentiate it based on imaging from other entities that can potentially mimic it, like just plain diffuse adenomyomatosis or adenomyomatous hyperplasia, as it is called, where you tend to see wall thickening and several cystic foci in the gallbladder wall, giving it a string of pearl sign, or sometimes you tend to see more complexity with T1 hyperintense foci within the gallbladder wall. So I don't think it's possible to prospectively differentiate the two. Perforated acute cholecystitis with the pericholecystic abscesses can also look similar, and so can xanthogranulomatous cholecystitis. All of these have similar appearance. The clinical patients with adenomyomatosis usually do not have any pain or any symptomatology, while perforated acute cholecystitis are almost always very symptomatic with acute abdominal pain, fever, etc. And xanthogranulomatosis cholecystitis is very variable. You may or may not have any symptoms. On one end of the spectrum, they are like adenomyomatous hyperplasia, completely silent. On the other end of the spectrum, they present just like perforated acute cholecystitis. This entity is interesting because just like branch duct IPMNs, they are prone for malignancy. You can see cancer develop in these patients, but the gallbladder surface itself is usually devoid of any changes. So unlike other entities like IPMN, biliary IPMN or IPMNB, IPNB, or the ICPN, which is IPMN of the gallbladder, these are all associated with field defect, which means once you have one lesion, they are prone to develop a malignancy anywhere along the mucosal surface. While this particular entity doesn't seem to be associated with changes in rest of the mucosa. So it's an isolated pre-malignant condition. That's all. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you, everyone. Happy to take any questions if you have.